Wawel, the royal castle and cathedral, salvation history, and world history. Wawel Hill is thick with history, political and religious history made by kings, queens, courtiers, and bishops, cultural history, the creation of storytellers and musicians, the history of architecture and decoration, the work of architects, painters, weavers, and sculptors, the personal histories replete with triumph and tragedy of those who lived here, are buried here, or have made pilgrimage here. To stand on Wawel is to be immersed in a millennium of history. But what is this history that can be touched and seen and felt here? The remarkably rich historical texture of this epicenter of Polish national identity invites a reflection on the relationship between world history and salvation history, between history as it is understood by historians and journalists, and history understood as what philosopher Peter Kraft calls his story, the story of God in the Bible at work in the world. Insofar as the late modern and postmodern world thinks of spirituality, it tends to imagine the life of the spirit as the human quest for the transcendent, the divine, the other. That is not, however, how biblical religion thinks of the spiritual life. Biblical religion is not about the human search for God. Biblical religion is about God's search for us. The God of the Bible comes into history and asks his people, first the people of Israel, later the people of the church, to take the same path into the future that God is taking. That is the bright thread that weaves Exodus and the Gospels, the prophets and St. Paul, into a single tapestry of revelation. God taking the lead and, as it were, clearing the path, with the people of God learning, often the hard way, to follow that path. Read through biblical lenses, then, history really is his story, and that brings world history, as it is or used to be, taught in elementary and secondary schools, into a new light. Until recently, world history was taught to youngsters in a linear fashion, under chapter headings that divided world history into manageable chunks, one following the other. Early civilizations, Greece and Rome, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, Renaissance and Reformation, the Age of Science, the Age of Revolution, the Space Age. There's obviously truth here. That is more or less how the history of the world has unfolded, at least viewed from the perspective of the West. But from a biblical point of view, to read world history through those conventional chapter headings is to remain on the surface of history, seeing only what might be recorded by an ancient chronicler or poet, or a modern reporter. The biblical view of history, history as God's search for humanity, and our learning to take the same road through history that God is taking, suggests a different set of chapter headings for a true world history: creation, fall, promise, prophecy, incarnation, redemption, sanctification, the kingdom of God. Reading world history through lenses ground by biblical faith, according to those chapter headings, allows us to see history in its true depth and against its most ample horizon. Reading history as his story gets things into proper and breathtaking perspective. For, read as his story, history comes into focus as the history of salvation, a history that begins not with randomness, but with purpose, a history that ends not with oblivion, but with a great cosmic eternal party, the wedding feast of the Lamb described in the 21st chapter of the book of Revelation. Moreover, in the biblical view of things, which is how Karol Wojtyła, St. John Paul II looked at things, salvation history and world history do not unfold on parallel tracks, as if world history is here and salvation history is there. No, salvation history is world history read truly. Salvation history is the depth dimension of world history. Salvation history is what is happening inside world history, whether the world recognizes that dynamic within itself or not. Salvation history is what is drawing history on, not mechanically but spiritually. Understanding the truth of biblical religion as the drama of God's search for us is important in itself because it is an antidote to that great deadener of perceptions, boredom. Living history, including our individual personal histories, as our participation in his story, is endless adventure, and adventure is never boring. Understanding history as God's salvific search for us is also important in meeting the challenge of what the great 20th century French theologian Henri de Lubac called atheistic humanism, which has been a destructive dynamic in Western civilization for more than 2 centuries now. Atheists, those who are literally theos, without God, or without the gods, are nothing new. What was new in 19th century Europe, de Lubac argued, was an atheism that condemned the God of the Bible as the enemy of human liberation and maturation, the God who must be cast aside if humanity were to grow up and live in freedom. This, de Lubac suggested, was turning things upside down in a great and potentially harmful inversion. For the God of the Bible had come into history as a liberator, and to miss that truth was to miss something essential to the civilization of the West. Ancient gods were fearsome deities. The Philistine god Moloch demanded and got the sacrifice of children, against which the prophets of Israel railed as against no other form of wickedness. The Aztec deities of ancient Mexico were thought to be appeased by the vivisection of those offered to them in sacrifice, their beating hearts ripped out at the summit of great sacrificial pyramids. Then there were the Greek gods, a bit more humane perhaps, but whimsical on some occasions, cruel on others, the deities for whom even the strongest of humans, think of Achilles in the Iliad, were in the final analysis playthings on a cosmic game board. Into that kind of spiritual cosmos, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham and Moses, the God whom Jesus called Father, came as a liberator. The God of the Bible did not demand human sacrifice. The God of the Bible condemned this ancient abomination. The God of the Bible did not play games with his creation. The God of the Bible freed his people from slavery, both chattel slavery and the slavery of sin. The God of the Bible did not leave men and women in confusion or fear about their lives and their futures. The God of the Bible created humanity with an instinct for goodness, gave his people a moral code to prevent them from falling back into the habits of the slaves they had been, and offered them a future in which the consummation of history would not be a conflagration, but the satisfaction of the deepest desires of the human heart. That God is a liberator, and it is a calumny to suggest otherwise. To understand history as his story armors 21st century men and women against that calumny, even as it reveals the shallowness, indeed the silliness, of the new atheists and their project. To understand that salvation history is the deep current running inside world history is also to understand, with St. John Paul II, that life has an inherently dramatic structure. Karol Wojtyła's theatrical experience gave him a useful set of skills. Sir John Gielgud, a superb actor in his own right, once commented on John Paul II's remarkable sense of timing in his public addresses. Another great figure of the 20th century stage, Sir Alec Guinness, a distinguished Shakespearean long before he became known as Obi-Wan Kenobi, wrote in his diaries of John Paul II's strikingly clear voice, a way of articulating things in public that he began to learn from Mieczysław Kotlarczyk, and which he practiced at length with his fellow members of the Rhapsodic Theatre. Yet Wojtyła's immersion in the theatre, which included his experience as a playwright, was more than a matter of acquiring a set of skills. It shaped both his mind and the dramatic layer of his soul. It was a matter of acquiring a worldview, a way of seeing things that complemented both his biblical view of the world as the arena of salvation history and his philosophical reflections on human moral agency. And in that way of looking at things, every human person lives inside a drama. Each of us lives every day in the gap between the person I am and the person I ought to be, which is an inherently dramatic situation. Mind the gap is a ubiquitous safety instruction on the London Underground, reminding tube passengers not to get their feet caught between the train and the platform edge. Mind the gap is also, however, a very good description of the moral drama of the human condition. To mind the gap is to be mindful daily that life is journey and pilgrimage, and that we become better fitted for following the trail that God is blazing through history when, by cooperating with God's grace, we try to close the gap between the person I am and the person I ought to be. Wojtyła's biblical faith taught him something more about the dramatic character of the human condition. It taught him that each of our personal dramas plays within a cosmic and historical drama, the drama of salvation history. And that drama has God as producer, director, scriptwriter, and ultimately protagonist. For God himself enters the drama fully in the person of his Son, so that the drama of history might be redirected to its proper trajectory, which leads from the creation to the wedding feast of the Lamb. Thus, we do not live our personal dramas by ourselves. We are, as the letter to the Hebrews teaches, surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, Hebrews 12:1, who alongside us and before us and ahead of us are living or have lived the drama of their lives within the great drama of salvation history.